So the first thing we're going to do, in a moment, I'll hand over to Tom Barton, and Tom will provide us all with an update and some feedback from the previous forums. So he'll set the scene for what we're talking about. And then he'll hand back to me, and I'll give an introduction to the GIRI leadership training, the GIRI leadership workshops that we run. And we will use an element of that workshop where we're going to look at optimism bias. And we're actually going to do a get it wrong, what we call a pre-mortem type exercise. And we're going to apply that technique to the problem of a race to the bottom. And I'll also introduce this 5 whys questioning technique. So we're going to take part of our training and then apply it to the particular issue of a race to the bottom. After we've done that workshop, we'll sum up, try and make some key deductions that are going to be of use, and then we'll hand back to Tom for a summary. So what I'll do now is, Tom, if I can hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Nick, and welcome to you all for coming this afternoon. Our research showed that the industry is wasting some 21% of its turnover on correcting error, of which you can see the pie chart there. 5% is direct costs, 7% indirect costs, process waste, unrecorded process waste. That's just literally doing things inefficiently is 6%. And then latent defects, 3%. That's not exact figure. It could be a bit higher, could be a bit lower. But if you put that in the context that the average construction company's waste is making about 2%, and probably not even that at the moment, it really is a bit of a no-brainer that we ought to do something about it. So, we have an industry that turns over 100 billion a year, so we're wasting 22 billion pounds a year. So we could almost start an HS2 every year. So and all the money that Boris is talking about spending, well, it's there already if we actually found a way of being more efficient. Next slide, please. So the Get It Right initiative is our strategic aim is simply to improve construction productivity by eliminating error. No more and no less. And we've had some forums. This is the last of a series of forums that we've had during the COVID lockdown. And so just refreshing ourselves as to what we've been doing. We had a session on managing and motivating staff, behaviours to prevent error, creating and maintaining a positive culture, and working with a changing supply chain and materials. I personally have found them really interesting. I found some of your feedback to us really interesting. So I hope you did. You thought that was useful as well. A few thoughts now, given where we are, and just as we come to the end of this series. So is the Emperor operating in new and innovative ways? I certainly think that it is in some ways, and some quite interesting things came out from our forums. I guess the question is, will we continue to do some of those good things once the pressure's off and once COVID-19 is behind us? Who knows when that will be, but I just hope and pray that we latch on to some of the good things we're doing and continue to do them subsequently. So what should our leaders be doing to eliminate error, and are they doing it? Do we think our leaders really are leading? I'm not sure that's for me to answer, but I do think it's an important question, and maybe you might like to think about that, particularly as we start to go through what Nick's going to talk about today. Nick, I thought that you might like to see, and Nick talked about the chat box, and one of the good things about the chat box is that what you've said can be recorded. Now you might think, oh dear, not sure about that. So I just thought that these are just 3 that we picked out from earlier forums. Quality, at the very least, to be given a place at the table in project inductions. I'm not sure how many companies do that. Slow down and plan, and how we will record and prove we've done it right. Ownership and responsibilities. And then the last thing is, you go to jail for not complying with ISO 45001 or 14001, but not ISO 9001. And that's interesting. And again, some of you will have heard me say this before. Australian research has shown that 37% of accidents occur when rework's being done. At some point, I suspect the HSE might latch onto that, and that might have interesting consequences. So then coming up to the present, so I don't know what you think about this, but the building boom, build, as Boris said, I think yesterday. Does the government's recently announced Project Speed initiative mean that the industry will become more productive? Or will the race to the bottom simply become faster with an even larger legacy of errors? I mean, I think we've got to remember that the reason the government's doing this, its objective is not really infrastructure. Its objective is to provide more jobs. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But just remember, that's what the objective is. And that's what happened in the 20s. It was do anything as long as you're doing something to create work. The 1920s, forgive me. So interesting to see how our industry and its leaders are going to react to that. And then the final slide, please, from me. So, final thought. Should we be collaborating or should we be being confrontational? You didn't need to answer that question now, but I think it's a key part to what we've been trying to do. So with that, I'd like to hand you back to Nick and we'll hear what Nick's got to say. Thank you, Nick.
Great. Well, thank you. And what I'll do now is I'll carry on with the sort of structured lesson part of this session. So now, normally these leadership courses, they last one day, and we're particularly looking at project leadership today. So where we target a project team and help the leadership of that project team do two things. We look at their general approach and what they can do to prevent error. The second part of the training is more of a focused workshop that looks at the specific project that team is involved with. And it particularly focuses on what we call optimism bias. And how do you identify where errors are going to happen before they happen so that you can change things to make sure they don't happen in the first place. So what we're going to do today is a very accelerated taster of that second part of our project leadership training. So we're going to have a look at optimism bias, understand the get it wrong exercise, and then apply that to the particular challenge of this feared race to the bottom as we work our way through COVID-19. So the first thing I want to look at is optimism bias. What it comes down to is the fact that if you ask someone a question and you say, in a hypothetical situation, what will normally happen? And they'll give you one answer. But if you make that question personal about them and say, what will happen to you? People give a different answer. And we can see that with projects. If you say, all right, imagine a £10 million road building project over 2 years, how much over budget would it typically be? Everyone will give an answer. And how late will it typically be? They'll give an answer. But if you slightly change that question and say, oh, your project, how late is it going to be? How over budget is it going to be? How many problems are you going to have? People, because they're humans and they have those human brains, will give a different answer. And what we're talking about is coming out of COVID-19 as we've got this either race to the bottom or possibly just a race as we build. And there's going to be the temptation for us to just think, oh, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. And of course, that is what we get before we have this spike in errors that we're all about preventing happening. So what GIRI have developed is a technique, a methodology that enables project teams and leaders of companies to avoid this optimism bias and actually manage it. And this is based on an idea of a thing called a pre-mortem. So it's a mental trick where instead of saying, oh, imagine we're here now, look into the future. So we're looking into the future, what's going to go wrong? Because our brains will say, oh, nothing will go wrong, it'll be fine. But if we flip that and say, okay, imagine you're in the future and you're now looking backwards, tell me what has gone wrong, then actually our brains are much, much better at coming up with sensible answers. So the way we do this is we sort of bring together that pre-mortem and a simplified thing that's the concern cause countermeasure approach that, again, I'm sure some of you have come across from hospitals, the rail industry, manufacturing. It's a fairly common language. So what we do is we've got 3 steps in this process of the get it wrong exercise. So the first step is to identify your concerns. So this is not just general, oh, our concern is we're going to be late. It's actually focusing on actually what is the failure scenario. So identify the concerns. We then get under the skin of those concerns and actually identify the root causes. And we'll see how we do that, some techniques. And then once we've got those root causes, we can have targeted countermeasures. So we actually say, well, we know that this is what we're worried about. We know that these are the underlying causes, and we know that doing this will stop that, which stops that. So it's a very systematic way of preventing the errors. So that's the approach in simple terms. So what we'll do now is I'll just explain this process a bit deeper. So the first thing we do is we need to ask what's going to go wrong on this project. So we need to identify what our concerns are, and we can do this trick of looking backwards, going, well, imagine a project exactly the same as this, but it's gone wrong. What has gone wrong on it? And what we come up with is a list of failure scenarios. Now, the key thing here is that we don't just try to come up with big problems. We try to be quite discreet. You know, what is the actual thing that's gone wrong, the actual failure scenario? And that gives us a whole host of possible disasters. You know, the doors don't fit, the windows fall out, the pipe gets cracked, and we have a whole host of failure scenarios. So that's good, that's a starting point. But then what we've got to do is make sense of all those failure scenarios. And this is where we use our likelihood and impact approach. So what we do is we put all of the failure scenarios on Post-it notes, and then have a massive on the wall likelihood impact chart, and we put them all where we think they are. And that means that we can focus our attention on the things that are high likelihood and high impact. So that focuses us on, okay, these are the things we really need to worry about. And then we can select the top few concerns. So that's the first part. How do we identify the concerns that we are going to focus on? So that's how we get there. So the next thing is to look at the cause. So what we do is we look at each of those concerns in turn, so a discrete problem, a discrete failure scenario, and then we just ask, okay, why has this happened? Or why will this happen? And we're asking very discrete individual questions. And this is where this idea of the 5 whys comes in. So what we do is we just ask, okay, why did that happen? Write it down, capture it, and then we ask it again. Okay, but why did that happen? Ask it again. And the idea of 5 whys has been found through research. It was actually pioneered by Toyota in Japan. And they found that if you ask that question 5 times, and it's a rule of thumb, it's not exact, but if you ask 5 times, you generally get to about the right level of stuff that you can still influence, but you're really getting under the skin of the problem. If you just address the top level concern, well, the underlying problem hasn't been addressed. And if you ask 20 whys, then you'll end up with something that is so far out of your control that it's not worth even worrying about. But 5 whys really gets you to the nub of the problem. So that's how we look at the underlying causes. And then we have to come up with countermeasures. So this is where we look at each of those root causes, the very underlying root cause, and say, well, what do we need to do to prevent that thing? And the key here is that you don't just come up with your solution, you actually identify who is going to implement it and what's the deadline. So you have discrete, controllable actions, a bit like your SMART objectives, and go, right, we're going to do this. And we know that when you follow the chain, that is actually going to prevent this failure scenario, this concern from happening. So it's very tangible, very, very real what we come up with. So that's what we're going to do today, but in a really accelerated version for this idea of the race to the bottom. How are we going to deal with the race to the bottom? So again, everybody, and what I'll do is we're going to do a quick poll now. What I'd like you to do is think about specific things that you think will go wrong, or specific failure scenarios that will occur. Interesting here, someone will die, so that's fairly catastrophic. So who's put someone will die?
Liz Bennett.
Hi, Liz.
So hi.
So clearly you're thinking there's a direct link then to safety. Is that what
yes,
you're?
Definitely.
Okay. Yeah. Do you want to expand on that? Give any sort of explanation, or maybe experience of that, or examples?
just simply one of the best ways to get things right is to have the right people who now know how to do the right thing with the right equipment at the right time, and so on and so on. So if we've raised to the bottom, we won't have the right people there. They will be winging it, and they will not understand the complexity of the sector, and the consequence can be catastrophic.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, really interesting. And let's have a look at another one that jumped out there is inadequate fire stopping around penetrations. I know that's something that regularly comes up at our workshops. Can whoever put that maybe just to give an explanation of why they put that?
Hi, that's Ian from FIS. Rather than getting competent people to do the work, we get somebody with 2 cans of fire foam or fireproof foam and a heart full of hope. And that's too often seen on construction sites.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So you're identifying that there are particular high risk. I say risk in terms of getting it wrong, not necessarily safety, but yeah, there are particular high risk jobs where it is going to really come and bite us. Let's have a look at one more. So we've got increased carbon emissions. Can maybe whoever put that comment? That's an interesting one. Sorry, my thing's rolling around.
Hi, Dave Belshaw here. Hi.
Yeah. Hi, Dave.
Hi. Yeah. Carbon emissions are obviously a big thing for Bash Soltons from Vinci. And if we are pressured to cut corners, likelihood is we'll be going for cheaper materials, pushing to use cheaper generators, cheaper this, cheaper that, just to get the job done quickly. So. Okay.
So that's a really interesting link there, isn't it? That actually, speed has the it sounds like the time cost quality triangle, really, isn't it? All over. Yeah, cost and interesting. Let's have a look at one more. So we've got cheaper and less durable materials, a legacy of latent defects. I think someone put where is it? Project completion dates not met. So that's an interesting one when we're talking about racing. So maybe whoever put that, explain the completion dates and why that's a real risk.
Hi, it's Ian Mills. So if it's a race at the bottom, what people will be doing, they'll be cutting corners in terms of program durations, and they've seen this in the past. So programs will be cut right back to the wire. And of course, with all the other things that people have spoken about, the lack of expertise, the lack of competence, the lack of planning, we won't be finishing jobs on time. There'll be more jobs that get delayed, unhappier customers, and the industry will get a worse reputation than it already has.
Yeah. Okay. So the long-term damage could be significant. Now for this, thanks, Ian. For this session, what we need to do is pick one of these concerns that we're going to focus on. It would be great to dive into all of them, but clearly we don't have that time. And I'll scroll through these slowly. So anyone got an opinion on which one of these would you like to do a deep dive into? Have a look. Failure to chop competence, communication of instruction, competencies. Okay, we've got materials. Well, from those first few, I think we've got communication of instructions and competencies coming up again and again. So I think let's focus on that. So let's call it that we've got in lack of competence. Okay, now my writing with my fat pen, I've stolen some very, very big Post-it notes off my daughter. I haven't actually learned to write, but I've got the big Post-it notes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this screen behind me. Now, if I stop sharing, and maybe if I can ask all of you to turn your cameras off again, what should happen is that through magic, you will see my big board and big Post-it notes. And excellent. Okay, thanks everybody. So hopefully what you can now see is this chart. So this is one of the things we use in our normal training sessions, and it's just got the concern, the cause, and the countermeasure. And we're not going to go into the full detail of the normal session, but the concern we're going to look at in our deep dive now is the lack of competence. We're going to end up with people on our sites or in our teams who don't have the competence to do the job they're being asked to do. What we want to do is use this thing, the 5 whys technique. So we're just going to ask, why did that happen? Or why has that happened? Why will it happen? So let's ask that. And I think the best way of doing this is if we use the chat box, and we'll just ask that first level, lack of competence. Why will we end up with people or inadequately competent people doing jobs in this race to the bottom? Why will that happen? So maybe if you can just try and answer. So no training budget. Okay, interesting one. Anyone else got an opinion? So as a first level, so cheap subcontractors, cheapest wins, shortage of staff, cheaper, no investment in training. Okay, great. So it sounds like we're getting time for checking taken out, shortcuts, more demand than supply, wrong people appointed in roles of responsibility, poor management. So the two that jumped out at me there were cheaper staff and lack of training. Stuart, you made an interesting point there about key staff working elsewhere. Could I maybe ask you to unmute yourself and put your camera on and just expand on why you think that's going to happen?
Yeah, sure. It's Stuart Ryder here. Having spoken to a number of contractors previously, you see that a lot of their more qualified staff are on, say, bigger jobs, and they're trying to meet demand of projects. So they'll put maybe the lesser trained people on there, or in some cases, I hear a few horror stories where specialist subcontractors, the fully qualified guy might go out and win the work, but then you might get some of his team who are not as qualified to go out and actually do the work.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, and I think a lot of people have seen that, haven't they? Ian, you've made an interesting point about not defining competence for the roles. Could you maybe expand on that one, please?
That's a lack of pre-planning up front means, again, it's just a bit of an anybody will do, rather than actually saying what's the competent individual we need to perform that task appropriately. Okay.
Yeah. So it's that lack of planning time means that you just accept anyone who turns up almost.
Yep.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So I'm just scribbling on my fat post-it notes again. So what we've identified for these first root causes, let's put those up here, is lack of training and using the cheapest. So maybe let's focus on this lack of training one, and maybe use the chat box again. And why do we think there's not going to be adequate training? Why? Reduced margins, shorter. So Keith, maybe can you just expand on that? It's similar to a lot of other people, but maybe you can unmute and show yourself, and we'll see what you think. Hi, Keith.
Hi, Nick. Yeah, I mean, if we're in a race to the bottom, then there's going to be more competition on people going in at lower fees, lower tenders. So inevitably that means reduced margins, which means less money to spend on training.
Okay, no budget for training. Okay, and we've seen. So, Paul, you've mentioned about availability of trainers, so that's an interesting one. Why do you think that's a problem?
Because when you get into these pressure situations, the best people are often committed to doing the work and not necessarily having time to train others.
Okay, so you're seeing that the trainers are the same people as the valuable staff on site.
Often the best people to train are those who are really good and competent themselves. So there's always a tension between whether they train or whether they do.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. That Aid, I can see you've put down about costs and not identifying the right type of training.
Yeah, just a good example is we're quick to do rather than plan, and we have what can I say, designers, supplier designers that have jumped into CDM design or CDM regulation planning management. However, a good number of them are not CDM trained. That's a good example right there. So, and these were picked up on audit. So it's them firstly identifying the plan ahead, and putting the measures in place to ensure that the employees are adequately trained. And how do they regulate when certain requirements need renewing, licenses need renewing, CSCS cards need renewing, that sort of thing. But people we get into the mindset of once you're done, that's it. But it's a journey. You need to constantly review how often the training is required, or you lose sight of regulations and plans.
That's really interesting. And the thing that pinged into my mind is that my car is currently overdue its MOT.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think there are probably many thousands of cars around the country that are the same. And actually, that's probably the situation we're in with everyone's competence on every construction site if everything's been paused.
Yeah. And I'll give just one more example is, for example, take auditing as well. I've been in auditing situations where I've been approached by another auditor, but they are certified to ISO 1998 or 2008, but rather than 2015. But they think when they did it then that they're an auditor for life, and that's it. Right. So that's just a small example, but that cascades across various training requirements in the industry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, interesting. Yeah, the idea that I did this once, therefore I'm. Yeah, so it's a very different thing, isn't it? The competence and having attended training. And we can fall into the trap of thinking that, oh, someone once has got a tick in a box and therefore we're covered, and that's not what we're saying at all.
Yeah, I think it's identifying that balance between the adequate amount of skills, training, experience, and knowledge. Some might, it's almost like a diamond. Some might skew too much to one, and it's that and will be deficient in the other. So you might have the experience, you might have the knowledge, but you don't have the certificates to back you up. Or you might be approached with all the certificates as long as you're on, but you don't have the experience to do the job.
Yeah.
So it's just getting that adequate balance in place.
And that's really interesting as we exit from this current situation, is where and actually it might be that people are deficient in all of those right now. Whereas normally you'd expect people to be bouncing around that triangle.
Yeah.
Really, really interesting. Thank you. That's really valuable. And Elizabeth, I can see that you've talked about the need to integrate topics. Could you expand on that? I think that might be quite pertinent as we.
I've tried to give an example, but I think that our projects are so diverse and the complexity of things that we need to be able to deliver success. So I'd support that the view that was expressed earlier, that it's the senior people who are actually doing that in practice, who are demonstrating that, who can best show the rest of us how to do it. But we divide it up into little silos. So we have health and safety separate from this and separate from that. And interesting, if you talk to what I consider a proper engineer, they will say, well, we would be doing CDM anyway. You know, it's not based on anything magical and wonderful. It's based on what good looks like in the first place. But we need to integrate that in ways that land well with the people that we're working with. And I think that is very difficult to achieve across a broad industry with major projects and small projects and so on.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting. And actually that sounds like a bit of a deeper dive into this idea of the wrong types of training. And it's not just the wrong types of training, but we've also got siloed training. So we might not have the training at all. If we have got the training, it might be the wrong type of training, and also it could be siloed. So in the interests of keeping things on track, because clearly we've got lots of people and lots of issues to discuss, I think we've had a reasonable go at diving into the underlying problem in terms of this lack of competence. So we've identified that people doing jobs are not going to be competent to do the jobs if we've got this race to the bottom. And we've identified that one of the key reasons for that is that there's going to be inadequate training. And part of that inadequate training is that there's not going to be the budget for training. We're going to have possibly people doing the wrong training, and also siloed training, where even if they've done training, it's separate lumps of training that does not create a coherent whole competence to deliver the job. So I think this gives us something useful and interesting to then try and address. Sorry, I'll just sort out my post-it notes before they all fall off. So what I'd like to do now is, if we go on to the next question, which is actually, what is our countermeasure? So what we want to do is have a look at each of these different root causes in turn, and say, is there anything we can do to try and address this? Is there something that we can do to make this situation better? In the chat box, if you could please, we will focus first on this. Let's have a look at this issue of the wrong type of training. So is there anything we can do, any countermeasure that we can put in place to make sure that people are not having the wrong type of training, or we're not employing people who have the wrong type of training? Stuart said document the exact needs. Okay, training needs analysis. And so Aaron, could you maybe unmute and explain that?
Yeah, hi everyone, Aaron Penwell from Lean Practice. Yeah, we need to do a thorough kind of training needs analysis. What actual needs are required for the process that these people are performing? Then also a set of competencies. So what competencies do they have, and where are the gaps? So analysis of the actual process, and then analysis of the actual person, and then the training will then close those gaps.
It sounds like the problem is not having a training needs analysis. So if we haven't got a training needs analysis, so I'll stick that on there. Hopefully you can sort of see that. So that's really interesting. And what other? Oh, we've got a good buddy mentor for new staff. Paul, could you maybe expand on that?
I think this is just often the easiest way to make sure that you understand whether people know exactly what needs to go on in your organisation, is because you can do a needs analysis and you can assess what training somebody says they've had if they come in, but you actually need to sort of check that on the ground. And I think that's often best done by a trusted mentor or buddy, whatever you want to call them.
That's really, and that sounds like it's maybe going back to what Aid was saying earlier about, it's all well and good that someone has a piece of paper, but that's not the be all and end all. You actually want to be thinking about competence, and you're suggesting then that having mentors, having someone who you do trust, providing that insight could be a really powerful way of checking that.
Yeah, it's the sort of same thing as me saying that, you know, the best people to be actually making sure training is relevant are those who are actually doing it and still doing it themselves.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So if they are slightly short, then it is a problem. But if they are actually good and competent, they're definitely the best people to kind of train others, in my view.
The other thing, or one of the other many comments that jumps out, is Mike, you mentioned about technical competencies related to project requirements, which sounds similar to what Aaron was saying, but can you maybe expand on that in terms of getting the technical competence right for a specific project?
Yes, for years we've had training programs within the company where we've taken on package managers and construction managers. Now we're moving more towards engineering side of things, struggling with people having the right competencies for most of them based around structures and managing packages. So it's that side of training they've got. But when you're putting them out there and saying, right, you're managing a highway now, it's absolutely clueless. And we get new starts coming in, graduates coming in, and we tend to put them on, give them a £500,000 package to manage. Very little training, instead of having that back to basic 2 years training as an engineer on site before you start looking at managing packages. There seems to be a way of everyone's just throw someone into it. We need a new package manager. Let's get someone in to do it. Someone will mentor them until they get too busy with their 5 packages, and then things just slide.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So you're just and again, it comes down to this sort of putting bodies, but what you're saying is you need to actually, for a project, identify the competencies, and actually you need the lead time before that. So it sounds like there are sort of two parts to this. One is you need to do the analysis and identify the, or maybe more than that, you've got identify the competencies required for a project. You need to make sure you do that early enough that you're able to then get the right people. And when you get those people, it sort of comes back to what Paul is saying about not just relying on a certificate, but actually having some sort of real validation of competence. So that sounds, yeah, that sounds like a really powerful way of then tracing back all the way through this to lack of competence. How are we addressing that lack of competence? Okay, really interesting. Thank you. So I will stick that on the board. And obviously that was pretty rapid, but what we've hopefully done there is, from our brain dump of what on earth is going to go wrong about a race to the bottom, we've picked out a thing to target. We've had a look at the underlying causes of it and turned it into discrete actions that we might wish to take. So we had a look at optimism bias and basically engaging with this idea that we shouldn't just be saying it'll be fine. We had a look at that get it wrong process. So identify our concerns. What are the failure scenarios? Pick out the most important ones. Have our 5 whys technique and look at the underlying root causes of those. And then for those root causes, identifying specific targeted countermeasures that we might be able to take. So what I think would be useful is, obviously I've tried to corral those thoughts into a sensible answer, but I'd really like to hear what all of you think. So what is your one key action you would like to take in your company to address this race to the bottom? Aaron, can you expand on what you mean there, please?
Yeah, thank you. So I think sometimes people have competence and that competence can be validated, but when it comes to fulfilling or playing out that competence on a project, they may not have the confidence in actually performing that job at the expected levels. And that's a lot of that's to do with culture, a lot of that's to do with leadership, but it's something that we all need to be mindful of. There's, on paper, yes, this person's competent, yes, we could validate them, but when they're out in the park actually performing, are they actually confident in performing that role? And that's where it comes to these managers that Paul was talking about earlier, really coaching and helping people.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and I think it's something that we often forget, don't we? We forget that people are human beings, and there's more to this than a certificate, or a certificate and a contract. We're actually dealing with people, and yeah. Okay, and let's have a look. So Ian, you've said in the race to the bottom we need to refocus as to what the real competency needs are across the sectors we work in. Could you expand on that, please, Ian?
Yeah, hi. So I'm thinking I think we all know that we've got good project managers and we've got average project managers and we've got ones that we don't trust. They all exist in our business, but we've got so many competency needs. I think somebody mentioned it before, that somebody in health and safety would define you need these, somebody in environment will define these. What are the real things that are going to drive that project? And if you get the right competencies in 3 or 4 people in the project, they will drive the other needs within the project anyway. So it's really saying, okay, what are the key things that we need to have? We know in this race to the bottom, we're not going to get 100%, but where are the things that are going to make the difference and the biggest bang for our bucks in getting the right competencies on this type of project? And I think if we don't have those, then stop work. Just absolutely make it clear. So these are the things that we're going to do, and these are the things that we're going to deliver, because we know that they drive everything else. Okay.
Interesting, thank you. And maybe just one final comment. Maybe Dave, can I ask you just very quickly to comment on what you've said about fully licensed? Maybe you can just explain what you mean there.
Yes, we with the ICM we've been championing registration of competence. In 2018, we launched and trademarked the National CDM Competence Registry. We're moving forward with that, with the CITB in the digital competencies framework too. We actually need, you know, anyone can be a company director. 13 quid, is it? Something like that. You form a limited company, you can put some few flash badges on it and all this sort of stuff and whatever. Give clients all sort of spiel that you can do all this sort of thing, wear the right clothes, the pinstripes and whatever. And yeah, you know, nobody actually checks when you give them these sort of glossy stuff, because I've had them come into my and give. So, you know, if we have a proper license registered.
So okay, can I just ask Elizabeth to comment, because I can see we've got some differing opinions. So maybe Elizabeth, you want to just explain your comment on that?
Yes, I don't think we need to focus on the technical capability. Was in a meeting actually with David earlier on today, looking at a research project, and there was one of the directors of COVI, the international experts on complex structures there, and he was saying, you know, because we were talking about CDM and health and safety, and he was saying that CDM is simply about, principal designer is simply about what a good engineer should do. And I absolutely agree with that. And I think that we need to refocus on being an engineer, on understanding how soils work, how structures work, how whether a dam is going to collapse, stuff like that. And I'm not saying, I'm a health and safety professional as well as a fellow of the civils. I'm not saying that we don't need health and safety at all. I'm saying that health and safety is like employment or finance. They're a support function to the people who are really adding the value. And so I would like to see us understanding that as an industry and not focusing on the certificates around what you know about CDM.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I think we have just opened a massive can of worms 2 minutes before the end of this webinar. But okay, really interesting. And I think we're probably all of one mind that we definitely need competence. And I think we're probably can have some interesting discussions about the role of certification in demonstrating competence. And that's. But what I will do now is, if I can hand back to Tom, please, and maybe you can close us out. So thank you very much, everybody.
So thanks, Nick, and thank you all for all your contributions. It was really interesting that we sort of got into to training, and I'm just going to wind the clock back a bit. You know, we talked about what's the issues of the race to the bottom are, and what are the competencies. First of all, and somebody said stop work. Just go back one stage. You don't actually have to start in the race if you don't think it's right to start in the race, or you haven't got the right racehorse. Forgive me for mixing metaphors a bit. So, and so competence is, of course, absolutely vital. But again, in terms of appointments, why do we appoint the cheapest whatever to do something rather than the most competent whatever to do something? And if there was a lot more, which is what GIRI is trying to do, a lot more of trying to make sure that the people we use, the organizations we use, are competent and have the right systems in place to ensure that their people are competent, we're in a better place to actually do things right all the way through. So I think a fundamental thing is, and I asked at the beginning, and I showed up a slide as to what should our leaders be doing to eliminate error, and are they doing it? And what I'd say is what they should be doing is ensuring that they have the right competent people. I mean, they should have always been having the training in place. That may or may not be the case, but certainly that's true. But secondly, that they should where they should be insisting that the people that are employed and the companies that are employed have the right systems in place to be competent, not just keep racing for the lowest price. Easy for me to say that, I get that, but that's fundamentally the only thing we should be able to do. As I say, somebody said we need to stop. I'm saying we need to say no if we don't think we can do it. So just to complete, basically, I'd just again like to thank you all very much for listening today. This is the last of our series of, if you like, COVID seminars for certainly this side of August. We may have some more in September. We have got a joint event with the IC coming up later this month. And then we've also got some events coming on in September. So with that, I'd just like to thank Nick for all he's done, and thank you for all of your contributions, both today and in the other events before. So thanks very much indeed. Thank you.